After the initial euphoria of Washington passing a deal and President Biden signing the $61 billion aid package for Ukraine, now things are starting to settle back into a little bit more of the reality, and people aren't cheerleading so much as what they were before. Well, actually, some of them are still cheerleading. We'll get to that in a minute. But on the battlefield, some of the realities are now so egregious that they can't even be hidden. As you're going to see here in just a few minutes, the commanding general of the Ukrainian armed forces is now openly admitting that they're being pushed back in some key areas on the Eastern Front. And then it becomes more and more apparent, or should become more and more apparent, that these weapons and this ammunition that are part of this package are not going to turn around the situation on the ground. The war is still, as I've been telling you for months now, decisively weighted on the Russian side, irrevocably weighted by all accounts. And it is foolish to continue going down a path that can't result in a success, that can't even hold what they have, much less ever push Russia out of the territory it's already seized in Ukraine and the Donbass. It should be therefore a rational, logical, and as we're going to argue, moral thing for the United States to seek a negotiated settlement on the best terms possible, given the situation that we've had and where it's likely to go. To help break this down, we have show favorite and my mom's favorite, Matthew Ho, who she's always watching when you're on the show. So hi, Mom. But Matt, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Daddy. Appreciate that.
So look, let's just get into this. We have this report out just hours ago about the commanding general of the Ukrainian armed forces, Serhii. General Serhii said this.
Mm-hmm. In posts made on social media, the Armed Forces Commander-in-Chief, Oleksandr Syrskyi, said Ukrainian troops had retreated to new positions further west as Russian forces rapidly approached Kurakhove and Pokrovsk.
We are interacting with our partners at all levels to achieve the level of efficiency in assistance that is needed not only to hold our positions, but also to disrupt Russia's war plans. I emphasize the need for Patriot systems. They are needed as soon as possible.
Strong demands for a desperate situation. With Ukrainian forces vastly outnumbered and Kyiv struggling to recruit more soldiers, Zelensky is counting on fresh US supplies to turn the tide of the war.
And when it comes to turning the tide of the war that Zelensky seeks, he actually added a little bit more clarity on what he seeks in this clip.
Our teams, Ukraine and the United States, are currently working on a bilateral security agreement, and we are already working on a specific text. We are discussing the specific foundations of our security and cooperation. We are also working on fixing specific levels of support for this year and for the next 10 years, including armed support, financial, political, and joint arms production. The agreement should be truly exemplary and reflect the strength of American leadership.
10 years he's talking about, and on a report out, what it was just a few days ago, a week or so ago, Gary, if you can throw that headline up there, Zelensky actually is still saying this bill now gives us a chance for victory. So he's still locked into, we're not just going to stabilize the front. We're not just going to set up, to try to negotiate for a better position, but we still actually have victory. Is he right, Matt? Is there a shot at victory?
That's what the messaging and the talking points will all instruct everyone to say. I saw that Senator Elizabeth Warren in relation to the $95 billion foreign aid bill, of which 61 is going to Ukraine. That Senator Warren said something along the lines of, "This will allow Ukraine to go fully on the offensive." I mean, so the talking point, really? Right? Yeah, exactly. So you have the supposed very progressive U.S. senator from Massachusetts just repeating these talking points that have no basis in reality. Because, most, even those, as you were saying, Danny, even those who have been the most fervent or most in favor of this war in Ukraine have now tempered their speech. And even among those who are overly optimistic, they say things like an offensive in 2025. But those who are just going along with this because that's the correct political calculus for them, even though it's devastating to Ukraine, to the Europeans, to potentially the world, they're passing along these talking points without any ability to understand what they're really saying. So I think the celebration of this money getting passed was exactly what was needed. It gives people who want to continue this war something to stake into, something to grab onto and say, this is why it's going to turn around. And so it gives you that type of narrative control for the next, month or two, at least. It also, of course, builds the whole storyline of why didn't it work? Well, it got here too late. If we had gotten this money 6 months ago, so a year from now, 2 years from now, when, however long from now, when this thing is over, if Ukraine has lost, likely has lost, the line will be, well, the money didn't get to here in time.
The new stab in the back theory.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, which is a tried and true. It's very effective. Why wouldn't they use the stab in the back theory? You shouldn't expect them to be honest. They have been honest at this point. Why are they going to be honest in the future about it? Particularly when it's clear that they were wrong. But what you've seen too, though, is you've seen with what Zelensky was talking about. I was reading a bit about it this morning. The 10-year security guarantee he was talking. He was speaking about. Ukraine has already entered into those with a bunch of other NATO nations, and they don't really seem like they're actual real security guarantees.
They're not.
Yeah, they're just basically, this is what we plan to do with Ukraine for the next 10 years. We pledge to give Ukraine weapons and money in the future. And of course, there's no binding nature of it either. So it's not like there's a commitment that we will give $10 billion a year to Ukraine. It's locked in. We've both signed off on it. It's all very aspirational. It's all public relations based. But you're also seeing the understanding what, at least it's being expressed, what we all understand, I should say, that this type of commitment is there in the sense that there will be a continual reoccurrence of this budget battle. So within 4 months or so, we're going to have to see another supplemental because there'll have to be one done for this coming fiscal year for FY25. It was just passed for FY24. So within 3 or 4 months, probably maybe even sooner than that, we will see this discussion of, okay, we need another $60 billion for Ukraine. Because
we were so slow in giving it last year, and it's cost so much on the battlefield. We dare not make that mistake again. We need to get this one done fast. I think that's exactly right. Or they'll lose, and it'll be your fault.
Yeah, and this money is important because this is basically like the positive air pressure that keeps the house of cards standing, right? So as long as like that, the balloon is being inflated, it's upright. And that's what this $61 billion does. Of course, it does a lot of other things like, pays the military industrial complex very well. But the other thing is it does provide this influx of money into Ukraine that keeps this war going, but it also keeps the government in power and it keeps the economy from collapsing. So that's the real urgency of this money.
But here's the potential problem with all that, as I see it. And that article, I'm sorry, that report there by Deutsche Welle that I started off with, where it talked about the problems that what Serhii said and how they're falling back, et cetera. That if you watch more of that report, they went and talked to an expert at King's College in London. And at first, he was just making the same kind of comments, exactly like you said about the talking points. Well, this is going to extend the opportunity for Ukraine. It's going to now, breathe life into their operations and go forward. And then even the reporter did push back a little. He said, yeah, but it's an issue of recruiting. I mean, personnel are falling back. However many weapons and ammunition we have, there's not enough men on the front as we just reported here. So what's up with that? And of course, he didn't answer the question. He just, like they do, block and pivoted to something else. But that still remains. It's a manpower issue at the core of it.
That's right. It's you could send all the munitions over there, but if there's not someone to pull the trigger or yank the lanyard, it can't be used. It's just that simple. Ukraine has been fighting this war now against a much larger opponent for more than 2 years. They are exhausted. There's no relief in sight for those in the Ukrainian army. They have problems with recruiting. There are no volunteers, or essentially very little volunteers, and those they are having to use essentially press gangs to roam the streets and drag people into the army. You have about 900,000 Ukrainian men of military age who are overseas who have no interest in going back, and I don't blame them. I had a couple of I had to have some work done on my house last week, Danny, and two of the guys who were working on the house were Ukrainians, and they had come over after Russia invaded. And these great guys, incredibly hardworking guy, and I was so happy they were in my house rather than, in a trench someplace or already dead and buried in the mud there.
Were you able to talk to them about that?
I did. I spoke to them a little bit, but they were very saddened by what's occurring there, and they don't want to be there. They don't believe in it. Like most of look, there's a poll that came out at the end of March in Ukraine that found that 54% of Ukrainians have sympathy with those who are dodging the draft. Right? They understand why people are not, so you're talking more than half of Ukrainians are basically expressing the opinion that this war is not worth dying for. So
it's not winnable. There was an article that came out over the weekend. I don't remember if it was New York Times or Washington Post, but it was one of the big papers that it was talking about. The title of it was ostensibly that some of the POWs who have come back, from the Russian captivity, were talking about how they'd been tortured and treated all ill kinds of ways in the emotional trauma, et cetera, on top of PTSD, et cetera, which, who can be surprised? That's one of the reasons why you and I are so against war, because it turns men into beasts, and how they treat each other. And I'm sure it's going on by all the prisoners who've been captured by either side. But what really stood out to me, and I think was undervalued by most of the readers, was that they said that Ukraine had given those people 3 months to rest up and sent them back to the front. Now, for those who don't know, American standing policy, at least all the time I was on active duty, was if someone has ever been a POW and they're come back, they don't ever have to deploy again, ever.
Right.
But the fact that they're being sent back in after 3 months of so-called rest and recuperation, the emotional trauma of just being a POW, that was actually my biggest fear going into combat, is if I was not killed, but if I was captured by the enemy. And it's just horrible. But to then come right out of that, and Matt, as somebody who knows something about PTSD, what does that tell you about the state of play in Ukraine, that they're sending guys back in after POW right back into combat?
Well, they need the people. They need the manpower. They just don't have it. And so you see that type of that type of disregard for the well-being of your forces after they've been returned from captivity, including, like you said, being tortured. But the need for filling the front lines is so much greater. And they've been tinkering around the edges. They were, trying to, the Ukrainians a few months ago, their big solution was they're going to pull more people from desks and send them forward. I mean, that's not a real solution. The notion that the draft only goes down to the age of 25. So most people expect the draft to be kind of to rise from the age of 18, but really there's up until this recent draft legislation that was voted on and put into place a month or two ago, the minimum recruiting age was 27 years old. So those below the age of 27 were not being recruited into the Ukrainian army, which shocks a lot of people. And then now they just lowered it to the age of 25. Now, there are those who are young who have volunteered as well as other means. But the what you're seeing is that you're seeing a relatively older force as well. I mean, so we know at the end of last year, I believe it was, the average age of a Ukrainian soldier was 43 years old. I mean, that's just simply, it's 20 years too old. So, I mean, you have those issues too, where you don't have the force that you rightly need to do this type of military campaign. And this is what it is. It's a campaign. It's not one operation. It's not one battle. It's not, I mean, these men are on the front line, and that's it. I'm sure they get some leave, they get ability to come off, go see their families, but that's very limited.
Yeah,
And
and
there's no
that's
end
actually
date as well.
that's a point of contention among many serving soldiers. Because I read a lot of Ukrainian Telegram channels. There's lots of grumbling about that because they said there's a number of people who have never come off the line in basically 2 years. Some of them have been fighting the whole time, and the psychological issue of never being able to be rotated off the line. Some have a little bit. Some have gotten to go back for, like you said, short periods of vacation, but not enough time to do anything, and then go right back on the line because they don't have the units to be able to rotate units off, which is a normal part of any kind of sustained war. Certainly the United States has done so. We all routinely rotated units off. They can't do that. And I'm just telling our viewers that is a degrading capacity across the force that at some unknown point could just snap.
And there's so many things here. We could just do the whole episode about this, Danny, because there's so many things we could talk about. These men are not receiving adequate training. I mean, you read reports over and over again that within a few days, oftentimes against their will, being put into the Army, they're on the front lines. I mean, it might be a little bit exaggerated, but you're talking, we can credibly understand that their training is measured in single-digit weeks, and particularly probably on the low end of that spectrum, as opposed to the months you would expect that someone would be provided with before they were put into this position. There's the whole corruption of this. The whole system is corrupt. The way that men stay out of the Army is either to flee or to or to bribe, pay off the bribes, pay off the recruiting officers. And we've seen a number of scandals with the Ukrainian army, including last year, I think it was August or so. Ukraine, President Zelensky fired all the commanders of all the recruiting districts, like 13 or 14, all fired, who were in charge of recruiting in Ukraine in terms of bringing in people into the army because it was so corrupt. So you have this system as well, where they're not getting training. Many are there, and they know it's not fair. They know it's not just. They know the reason they're there is they just didn't have the however much it costs to pay someone off.
Bribe, yeah.
And it's causing fractures in the society because guess what? Like anyone else, who's now getting put into the military? Poor kids, right? Or not even kids, as we discussed. They're not that young, actually. But poor men who are being pulled away from their families, who are being pulled away from their lives. I mean, that's the trade-off when you take older folks. It's not just older men. It's just not that they're going to be physically not as fit, basically, as younger men, but also too, you're pulling them away from built lives. They were pulling them away from not taking away from young men in their late teens and early 20s, but when you start pulling men from their late 20s, their 30s, their 40s, you are disrupting their lives. So again, they're not getting the training. They're getting pulled this way. It's unfair. It's unjust. It's incredibly corrupt, and it's causing schisms, causing fractures within Ukrainian society as well. Because again, primarily poor and working class being pulled into the army, also predominantly from rural areas. And you hear this complaint over and over again. When you go to the cities, you see all these young men, partying basically, going to clubs. I mean, you hear this report, that report constantly. You hear that complaint constantly. So it's not something that is,
it's not one-off, not anecdotal.
Yeah, I mean, you shouldn't dismiss it. I mean, so you factor all this together, and then you factor in together the terror of the front lines, not just the exhaustion that we were talking about. They're not getting any relief. They're probably not getting the best food. They're living in terrible conditions, which wears you down. But then the terror of the front lines. There are parts of the front lines that you can't be exposed. You can't go outside, otherwise the drones are going to kill you. They all have friends and comrades who have been killed, who have been mutilated. And this is, as I was just saying with the drones, this is a very technical, futuristic type war. This is like something out of Black Mirror that people are familiar with, that sci-fi show, or almost like the Terminator in the sense of that robots are killing people. And so you couple that new type of fear, that type of again, science fiction type experience that these men are going through with the traditional horrors of war, seeing your friends getting killed, blown up in front of you, dying slowly in front of you, all those types of things. But then also too, just the overall terror, the overall shock, the stress, really it's stress of, say, the artillery, of the warfare, of
and
the,
by the way, Matt, on the screen right now, Gary's pulled up something he's showing. This is some of the press ganging that you were talking about, where they're literally grabbing some guy out of his car to pull him in. These are every day. I see these videos, folks. This is not just a one-off here.
And if you're seeing them every day, Danny, so how many?
Imagine how many we don't get videoed. Exactly.
And if you're Ukrainian, if Danny is seeing them every day, Ukrainians are seeing them every hour, a different one.
Yeah.
So
here's kind of the upshot of this. Now, I don't want to go too far in the direction of back in the direction of the Russian side, but it's critically important for what we're about to talk about here to note that the Russian side is not static. Everybody's talking about this new package, like the Russian side is like this fixed entity, and then all these other things will build up over time, and then they'll be able to go on top. But they're not fixed. They're continuing to expand personnel-wise, industrial-wise, learning new ways to fight. They're iterating with what they've done on the ground. So they're a growing, learning organization too, and they're showing definite capacity on that. We see now that on the Ukraine side, they're not growing. They're not having enough people come in to offset the losses even. So they're a net loss, whereas the Russians are a significantly larger net gain. So every month that passes, the disparity gets higher and higher. Given all that, it would be logical. If you take emotion out of it, it would say the side that's losing and is almost certainly going to literally physically lose the war should start the process of having a negotiated settlement to say, the more we fight, the more we lose. So where's the value in that? Let's cut this off. That's the logical thing to do. But here's what we are doing. So it starts with Zelensky, because so we talked about him wanting a 10-year thing. That's not the only thing he wants. Check this out.
We are also preparing for the NATO summit to be held this summer. A strong political signal is needed. The alliance should not be afraid of its own strength or shy away from its own foundations. Every country that shares common values and is willing to actually defend them deserves an invitation to join the alliance.
So you can say, okay, I get that. I understand why Zelensky's going to say that, because if there's any magical way he can get into NATO, then bam, he has Article 5 and Russia will have to stop its offensive or whatever. I mean, that's his idea. Makes total sense why he would want that. Obviously, we're not going to have a situation where we bring him in that almost automatically triggers war for all the rest of us, or are we? Check this out.
Ukraine will become a member of NATO. Our purpose at the summit is to help build a bridge to that membership and to create a clear pathway for Ukraine moving forward. We will see, I think, in the summit, very strong support for Ukraine going forward in its relationship with NATO.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So maybe we're not seeing logic. Okay, you're really tuned into messaging and what people are saying versus what they're actually thinking behind the scenes. It's hard for me to square this with any kind of rational plan. What is the thought process? I can't imagine that behind the scenes in the White House that they don't know everything you and I are talking about the realities on the ground, the battlefield. Given Zelensky's plea for NATO again, I think it was yesterday, what's the play here? Why do we keep saying stuff like that out loud?
You know, first of all, Danny, when President Zelensky mentioned the NATO summit, my stomach turned over. I mean, we have to, that's coming up again, you know, in the next month or two. We're going to have to go through that panoply of propaganda from every angle. You know, but the messaging is important. And that's why, you know, this idea that do they build the narrative first or they build the policy first? You know, I mean, you're supposed to have a messaging that reflects your policy, reflects your goals. But in this case, it seems as if both your policy and your messaging that's being, you know, enunciated, that's being articulated, are policies and messaging meant to cover for previous policies and messaging. Right. So that's why we're seeing this constant doubling down, this constant refusal to accept reality and to, amend the policy or at least acknowledge what's occurring in the messaging. And this becomes a very circular type process. It's like a world. It's like this great downward spiral, whirlpool. Took me a second to remember what you call that. And, but where you just get into this, you can't get off of this descent. You can't get off of this whirlpool. You're just being sucked further down in this circular arguing, trying to make up for things that you said before, for policies you put in place before, rather than addressing the actual reality of what's occurring. You're still trying to ensure that your previous messaging is successful. And I think that's what what we see here. And obviously the White House in the last few months had made a decision that staying in the war, at least keeping the war from ending before November of 2024, may be disastrous for the Ukrainians, but it's the correct thing for their reelection campaign. And I thought maybe they had an understanding that Trump would endorse the spending bill as well. That certainly now Trump is tacitly supporting this war, if not so outspokenly, but at least he's in agreement with it. And perhaps there is this understanding that there will not be contention on the war in the campaign, because certainly the war is unpopular with Americans. Majority are against further U.S. involvement, further U.S. spending, as opposed to those who want to continue it. But you also have within Joe Biden's base, you have a very fervent and loyal belief in this war. And that gets into the identity politics of it, because the people who believe in this war really do believe that they are supporting a classic good versus evil struggle. They really do believe this is democracy versus authoritarianism, that it is Zelensky is Churchill and Putin is Hitler. And like that type of identity, I think maybe the White House looks at that and says, this type of war, this cheerleading for war, this will get our base mobilized because they connect with it on such an identity level. It's also a juxtaposition against Gaza. So here's the good war that we're fully supporting. We're on the side of democracy. If you talk about messaging, if you listen to how the White House or Tony Blinken or others talk about Ukraine, it's about the Ukrainian people, right? It's not about Volodymyr Zelensky. It's about the Ukrainian people. And they try to make it as broad as possible. While if you listen and see how they talk about Netanyahu and Israel and Gaza now, it's all about Netanyahu. Look, I just did it actually. I just referenced Netanyahu rather than Israel, even though it is Israeli policy, even though the vast majority of Israeli people are in favor of this genocide against the Palestinians. Yeah. The West, particularly in the Americans in particular, are trying to spin off what's occurring in Israel as the result of Netanyahu's actions. So maybe this war in Ukraine, you can juxtapose that against what Netanyahu is doing in Israel. And maybe that's the calculation that they were making as to why they're addressing it, why they've embraced it like this. But there's also, too, the calculation we can't forget that Washington, D.C. itself is controlled by the military-industrial complex. Right. And the fact that those who are in positions of power throughout Washington, D.C., whether they be in Congress, in the executive, whether they be in think tanks and institutions, what have you, they are fully funded by the military-industrial complex.
Yeah.
But
so let me go down that path here, because the only way, or not the only way, but one of the major ways that the administration can keep this fiction going and to keep people supportive is if they have support and justification from others who are supposed to be experts, like retired Army generals. And so I'm going to show you 3 here that are being used, oddly enough, whether directly or indirectly, to support the administration's claim that this is going to make a difference. And we're looking to continue to go on into the distant future, et cetera. Without these supporters, it becomes much, much more difficult, especially when you have contrasted combat support or combat experienced people like you and I and McGregor and Jacques Beau and several of these other people who are emphatically saying the opposite. Here's what the generals are saying. First of all, let's start off with Brother Jack Keane.
Their plans are to hit every Russian military base of consequence in Crimea using that weapon system to drive the Russians out of Crimea without having to put a foot on that territory there. In other words, to drive their military strong bases out of Crimea. It doesn't mean they're not occupying it politically or militarily, but that is their objective. And now they have the wherewithal to achieve that objective.
So he's saying, yeah, what the president just did now then will allow us to drive Russia out of Crimea with a few missiles. Number one, that is just absurd on the face of it, that a few missiles is going to actually cause troops on the ground with no enemy troops to actually leave their positions, as though the Russians don't have any air defense, or as Defense One is reporting earlier today, the Russian electronic warfare capacity is making most of the weapons that we sent over obsolete. As you see here, this is another precision-guided weapon falls prey to Russian electronic warfare. That's in today's Defense One. And when you go in through there and you read, you see that the U.S. officials are actually openly admitting that many of the weapon systems and the so-called game changer missiles and bombs that we have sent over that were touted at the beginning are not even being used anymore. In fact, it talks about in that article that some of the categories of weapons, that I forget which one it is at the moment, the Ukrainians don't even use them anymore because they don't hit the target, because Russia's EW knocks them down. That's why you don't hear much about HIMARS anymore. So this idea that the long-range missiles from the ATACMS is suddenly going to turn of the war means you haven't been paying attention to how Russia's been defending against our missile forces. So some are probably going to get through, but it's just nonsense what they say. Right.
And that story you referenced there, Danny, on the ground-launched a small diameter bomb, if people recall that, the GLSDB, if people recall last summer and in the fall, this was going to be a weapon that was going to change the war, right? This is, and the reality is that it doesn't work because the Russians jam the GPS signals that the bombs use. It's really rockets. They're bombs attached to rockets, basically. Yeah. But then the other thing that's really striking about it as well, and this should be real, I'm sure folks who are familiar with the military who are in, not going to come as a surprise, but maybe for others it will. And this is a really telling tale. This is something you should take to heart, that this is the fact that when those weapon systems, these GLSDBs, got to Ukraine, one of the reasons why they're not being used is because they don't work. And why don't they work? Well, because they cannot operate in a dirty battlefield, i.e. they can't handle dirt, they can't handle mud. So, I mean, that itself should explain to people the reality of the United States empire, its military industrial complex, is that they can't even create a rocket system.
Looks pretty good at trade shows, though.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And successfully test it. We can't even do that in the process of how long they've been trying to get those things over there. I mean, so in that period of time, you couldn't actually test this thing in a situation where it might be dirty. And I did I have some testing experience and some procurement experience. So I know a little bit about that. And it's just this is the reality of the American military industrial complex. But if you look and see what they do, they do buy back tens of billions of dollars of their own shares. So the reason why these things aren't tested properly is, one, because the whole system is corrupt, and that's a bigger aspect. But also, two, the military industrial complex, the weapons industry, all this money they're earning off of these wars, these massive military budgets, they're not taking that money and putting it and reinvesting it into their own capital processes and their own facilities and their own, right? They are just going into executive compensation, or it's going into tens and tens of billions of dollars every year in stock buybacks. So, I mean, this is a great cautionary tale for people to understand when, you hear people say it's not going to work out. It's not going to be that way. It's not going to look like you think it's going to look. It's because of these types of real hard realities, such as we can't even produce a rocket that we can accurately test before providing it to the Ukrainians, that make this war. And then to Danny's point, this is not static. And what we're seeing on the other side, though, is we're seeing Russia very competently and capably expanding its military forces, learning from the last couple of years, creating new technologies or adapting to new Ukrainian technologies in a manner that you would expect from a serious military force during a war. I mean, the other story that was in there today as well, Danny, I don't know if you saw, I'm sure you did, maybe you got it queued up because this is close to your heart. The AP is reporting that the Ukrainians have pulled their Abrams tanks off of the front line because of the danger of the drones, which I think is something that is understood, particularly, say, since the 2020 Azerbaijan-Armenia war, as well as then, the U.S. Marine Corps divesting itself of tanks, because of the drone threat largely. But I think it's all these things about how the HIMARS, the SDB, the Abrams tanks. These are all going to win the war. So when you hear people like Keen talking about how ATACMS, as you said so rightly, these few missiles are going to knock Russia out of the war, or the F-16s are going to show up and it's going to be like Iron Eagle, you know, right? With the late great Lou Gossett, you know, wiping
great show. Good theater, bad policy.
Yeah. So
so let me ship on to the next one here. So that's at the kind of at the granular tactical level. The other thing that these generals do is say, you know, our big problem as General HR McMaster, former national security advisor for the president, former 3-star general. Wow, this one was really disappointing to me because I used to work under HR McMaster. I knew him for decades. After this, we were friends for quite a long time, and I just can't understand where he's going with this. But try not to cringe while you're listening to this one. But on CBS News last Friday, he went on to basically say that American weakness and our unwillingness to be strong, we'll talk about that on the backside of this clip, is responsible for, well, everything. Check this out.
I think what we're forgetting is Reagan's phrase, peace through strength. And John, what I see that connects a lot of these cascading conflicts and the looming crises, maybe in the Indo-Pacific, is that the perception of weakness is what is provocative. I mean, I think the February 2022 reinvasion, massive invasion of Ukraine is directly connected to the humiliating surrender, self-defeat, and withdrawal from Afghanistan. I believe that October 7th is at least in part related to our inability, or apparent inability until just recently, to sustain our support for the Ukrainians. If you're Ayatollah Khamenei and you look at the United States unable to support Ukraine, if you look at the contentious relationship, you know, for example, between President Biden and President Netanyahu, for that matter, the Israeli perception of weakness in Israel based on unrest associated with the judicial reform movement and so forth, it's that perception of weakness, I think, that led Khamenei to say, okay, now's the time to cross this off my bucket list, my destroy Israel task. So I think that's what we have to regain, this idea that we can maintain peace really through strength.
So I don't know how it was Hamas decided to attack on October 7th because of U.S. weaknesses. Iran decides to attack Israel because of U.S. weakness. It couldn't have had anything to do with Israel's policies over decades before that. Couldn't have had anything to do with Israel's launching a missile into a secure embassy compound. And then this whole thing about Afghanistan, we're going to touch on that again in a second, but that this weakness of Afghanistan suddenly launches into all these other things is absurd and laughable at the face value, even worse when you analyze it.
No, it is. It's but for people who want to understand why the world is the way it is, why it's burning like it is and continues to burn and will continue to burn, HR McMaster is one of the reasons why. He is personifying the American empire. It's full of either fools or liars. So whether or not McMaster believes the nonsense, the gaslighting, the lies he was just reciting, whether he believes it or he just doesn't know enough not to believe it, he actually thinks that's accurate. You know, this is how we get up with this is why the world looks like the world looks. This is why it's so dangerous, and why, you know, there has to be, well, let's just say this idea that somehow it's American weakness that caused all these events to just burst out, you know, as if there weren't, as you said, antecedents or any type of context. Yeah, but that type of thought, right? That it's like this siege mentality that those who are in the empire, those who are running the empire, have this type of under siege mentality that they're always lashing out. And so anything that occurs has to be about not being strong enough, not being tough enough, not being aggressive enough. And then that gets into
Matt, how can anyone say that when you look at just a cursory look at the record, when we're launching missiles into Syria, all throughout Africa, Iraq, assassinating people in Baghdad, shoot missiles into Syria routinely now, into the Red Sea, against the Houthis in Yemen. We physically took to the skies and knocked down a lot of these Iranian drones on the 13th of April. I mean, nobody uses force more than we do. We've got 800 bases or so around the world. We have the biggest military budget by 500 billion over the second one. How can anyone rationally even contemplate the idea that we're not using enough force?
We've killed more than 3 million people around the world since 9/11. I mean, so the idea that we're not violent enough or we're not aggressive enough. This is the bubble that these people live in. This is the environment. This is the world that they live in. They're fantasists and fabulous. They really do believe. McMaster really believes, along with the others that were in power with Trump, whether it was Jim Mattis or John Kelly, they subscribe to this idea that they are on the front lines, that they are the legionaries who are defending the civilized world, the civilized empire from the barbarians, and that you always have to be aggressive. So they have a security mindset in this, as opposed to, say, some of the others form of imperialists who are more involved in like the megalomania or more involved in the commerce aspects. These are men who see themselves as modern day legionaries who are devoted to the defense of the empire, and everything they see is a threat. And if they don't see a threat, that means the threat is hiding, and they have to go and root it out. I mean, so it's just, and then there's no interest, there's no need, right? It's not necessary to examine what you've done in the past, because this is the world that you live in. So the consequences of the past that are now animating the current world, your current reality, that's inconsequential. That doesn't exist. That's not how the world is, because the world to these men is a world where they have to be, again, on the edge of empire, battling it back against barbarians. This is a cosmic type of understanding.
It's as though you already knew what was coming next, because perfectly illustrating what you just said is David Petraeus. There's not a better one. And so I warn you to take your blood pressure medicine before this next clip, because I don't know, maybe it won't do anything to you because you'll just roll your eyes. But even as much as I used Petraeus and some of these crazy things he said, this one still caught my attention. So McMaster was saying our withdrawal from Afghanistan, prompted all these other people to take action, et cetera, from Putin all the way to Ayatollah Khomeini. But Petraeus is saying, well, I'll let him speak for himself on Afghanistan. Check this out.
I was not one who believed that you had to actually end endless wars. In fact, I opposed the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Yes, it was frustrating. Yes, it was maddening. Yes, our partners in Kabul were not all that we might hope they would be. We only had 3,500 troops on the ground. We hadn't lost a soldier in a year and a half. There was no reason. $25 billion and an $850 billion defense budget. So we need to be careful about this. This one, we need to ensure that Ukraine prevails when this is over.
So that's what I thought of when he was saying that, how I learned to love the bomb, from Dr. Strangelove. This is the modern day Dr. Strangelove. He actually said out loud, I'm for forever wars. We shouldn't have left Afghanistan. We should never leave Ukraine, by extension. Wow. What do you do with that, Matt?
I mean, if you're the moderator, you need to end the debate right there, end the conversation right there, unless you just want to get into a discussion of his psychological underpinnings of that. Why do you believe that? Otherwise, anyone who says that, what value other than curiosity are they providing to the audience? Saying something so daft, something so incoherent as I'm in favor of forever wars. I mean, what from the human experience of the last 300,000 years has provided anything to support such a thesis? And this is one thing that gets me upset as well, Danny, is this idea that we left Afghanistan and the Taliban didn't have a say. Petraeus rightly notes that no Americans were killed for the year and a half prior to the U.S. exit, to the U.S. American retreat. And why were no Americans killed? Because we had made a deal with the Taliban. And that deal with the Taliban say we will not attack American NATO forces, Western forces, until, as long as you leave. And what occurs then is that we're supposed to leave on May 1st, 2021. Joe Biden does not honor that date. He breaks the deal essentially with the Taliban. And the Taliban, who have warned us continually, if you break this deal, we will win the war ourselves. That's what they do. So May 1st comes, the Americans don't leave, and the Taliban say, we are now going to win this war. And they launch their campaign, and they just start rolling through province after province. But as if there was some type of ability for the Americans to not have to stop that. Sure, we could have used massive air power and killed a lot of people, but the Taliban were going to win at that point regardless. Whether we were staying or not, the Taliban, the collapse had already started before. The panic had already started in Afghanistan well before May 1st. By February of 2021, we're hearing reports that Afghan army and Afghan police forces are not just not receiving their pay, but they're not receiving bullets or food or any other forms of supply, because what was occurring was that in that house of cards, in that kleptocracy, so just like in Ukraine, so this is something people should reference when discussing Ukraine, is that once the fear of the money stopping coming in, so once when Joe Biden comes in the office and he's not firm in his commitment to keep the American presence in Afghanistan, the Afghans who are part of this kleptocracy rightly note that, well, this is probably going to be the end of our funding. This is going to be the end of the gravy train. And they start to panic. And that means they're not passing down, right, through that patronage network, through that patronage pyramid. They're not passing down what they need to pass down. So there starts to be a panic because the money's not showing up. And when that panic occurs, it's like a bank run, and that was occurring months before the Taliban launched their May 1st. So again, the United States may have been able to kill a lot of people using our aircraft, but it wouldn't have stopped the inevitable
anything.
Exactly. The Taliban. And so the fact is that again, what I was saying before about these types of men, those who populate the security wing of the empire, the Petraeuses, the McMasters, the Mattises, they don't get that. They see the world as just very black and white, as us versus them, of me having to kill the other. And it doesn't matter the reasons for the other's actions at all. They always have to be attacked. They always have to be killed. The grass always has to be mowed, as people have become very familiar with that phrase over the last many years, because that's just the reality of the world. And it doesn't matter if the reason why these people are now attacking your forces when you're occupying them is because you killed their fathers and their brothers and humiliated and raped their mothers and their daughters. It doesn't matter to them. That's all just how the world spins. The reality is this construct of those on the wall versus the barbarians outside.
And so let's circle back to where we started this conversation. Given all of that we've talked about here, you can see there are parallels between the Afghan situation and this one, in that we refused to acknowledge a war that was unwinnable and continued to try to ramp up more power, more bombs, more people, more different strategies, whatever, anything to avoid having a negotiated settlement until it finally just collapsed. So now then I argue that on a strategic level, though the conditions are certainly different in many respects, but the overall concepts are still very similar, in that this is an unwinnable war. It's not going to matter how many more bombs we send or anything else, because the fundamentals that at play are irrevocable, in my estimation, in Russia's favor. Whether this drags on another 2 years or whether the army collapses this summer is unknown, but the end is clear one way or the other. So is it moral, logical, and rational for the United States to continue to give more aid packages and 10-year guarantees and all kinds of things? Or is it the more rational, moral, and just right thing to do to seek a negotiated settlement now and acknowledge that we're not going to win? I mean, I think it's self-evident what I'm saying, but I want your view on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm complete agreement with that. That it's just not the moral case, but there's also a strategic case to negotiate now and to get some type of well understood and defined settlement to this that precludes or potentially precludes future war, future hostilities, future instabilities, as well as preventing the risk of this thing escalating up to, World War III, to nuclear war, which we talk about all the time. The strategic value in that is so much greater than the status quo. At best, this fire hose of cash that's being used to inflate the Ukrainian bubble remains on. And that bubble, it doesn't burst, it doesn't deflate, because as long as that money comes in. Of course, when the money doesn't come in, you've got problems. But the result of that then is this continuation of this war in its current phase. At best, that's saying the Ukrainian army doesn't collapse, the Russians don't decide that they want to advance fully up to the whole length of the river, take Odessa, et cetera, et cetera. That's all just in the status quo. You're just seeing just a meat grinder, just an enormous loss of life, massive suffering for those on the front lines, and of course their families and loved ones back at their homes. Environmental destruction, just infrastructure just being totally demolished. You have all the consequences of war, the landmines, unexploded ordnance, the toxic residue. All these things that are going to cause problems for generations. That just keeps, that doesn't go away. So not just the morally correct thing, but the strategically correct thing to do is to take what you can get now, because the risks of the alternative is either, again, the status quo, which is, as I think most people agree, is not just unwinnable for Ukraine, but unsustainable for Ukraine. But, the other side of it too, then, is that that's the best you're going to get, versus a negotiated settlement that freezes where Russia's at now, potentially provides a pathway for some type of political settlement in the future that reduces the instability, reduces the risk of the war continuing, let alone escalating. It's just a sounder move at this point. May not be what those who have staked their political careers on and their political futures on want, and that's of course the very important thing in all of this. But certainly for strategic and moral reasons, it is the right thing to do.
And let me just add one little piece to bolster your strategic viewpoint. There is that off the battlefield, there's costs to us that are accruing even as we speak. We have created conditions that are forcing and pushing and cajoling our enemies that were kind of stovepiped out there now together. Here's how Shoigu, the defense minister for Russia, put it a couple of days ago.
На контрасте с общей тревожной ситуацией планомерно выстраивается российское отношения наших стран, сохраняет высокую динамику развития, расширяется по всем направлениям и без привлечения националистов. Рассчитываю на самое тесное плодотворное сотрудничество с вами. Убежден, что сегодняшние переговоры.
So whatever one wants to think about the future of any potential conflicts, it's obviously in America's best strategic interest, and I'm talking like existential interest, for the other two major global nuclear superpowers to remain stovepiped and to separate. Ideally, you might even want to pit one against the other. But the last thing you'd want to do is to bring the two of them together. And China's making the similar kinds of statements about their eternal friendship with Russia, et cetera, none of which was the case. They were not anywhere near that close prior to our joining in with this war.
Absolutely, Danny. You're pushing together. You've made Russia stronger through this war. All the attempts at sanctions, all the utilization of the Ukrainians as pawns to wear down the Russian military. Those are the arguments of the last couple of years of what a great investment this is. We're only spending 5% of our military budget, and we're defeating Russia.
And famous claim, best money we ever spent.
That's right, and that was said over and over again. And now the reality is so inescapable. The Pentagon itself is saying, no, the Russian army is actually stronger than it was, and the same with their economy. No country wants to see an increase in military spending like Russia has. Because that, I think, for most nations is unsustainable. It also takes them away from what their own internal goals are. I don't think the Russian government's internal goal is to create a military-industrial complex like the Americans have, because they see the dangers of that. And it doesn't help your citizens. It doesn't help your people. And so spending as much as the Russians are spending right now on their military in this war will be problematic in a few years' time. But they're still in a much better position. This idea that they've lost the European markets, well, you know what? They have turned south and they have turned east, and they have found much larger markets that, and it's quite possible that the Russians will never go back to the European market like they once did. And they now will be focused on the South and the East more than the West. On the opposite side of that, of course, Danny, is the great damage you've done to European economies. You did damage to the world economy because of just in terms of general inflation that occurred as a result of the war. But the Europeans have really take a hammering these last couple of years. I mean, whether it's the destruction of the French and German Nord Stream pipeline, an act of war by, the Ukrainians and probably the Americans as well, right? Or it's the issues with regards to the prioritization of Ukrainian products and goods, particularly agricultural goods, into the European market, that have caused great harm to European farmers, as well as some European manufacturers. Then as well, you have the issues with the refugees. I mean, you've had roughly 7 million Ukrainians leave Russia, and majority of them have gone into
which were working
Western
in your
Europe.
house a couple of days ago.
Yeah, exactly. And we can absorb that here, but the Europeans are absorbing millions upon millions. And
so let me ask you, Matt, in just the last few minutes we have available here, that's what we are doing, which is ignoring reality and continuing to harm ourselves strategically and even operationally. I would argue, with the diminution of our industrial capacity and our own defensibility, because we've given so much of our own weapons away. But what should we do if you right now were elevated, to a position of authority in the U.S. government, the current administration? What would you say if you were just given a blank check? What should we do given all the situation right now, the things as they are? We just gave $61 billion. What should we do instead?
You end the war. You demilitarize Ukraine. You give Vladimir Putin a golden bridge so that he can exit eastern Ukraine, because I don't think he really wants to hold on to that. I think it's too difficult. I think the cost of that is greater than what he wanted. It's not what he wanted 2 years ago. And I think you could find a solution there if you give him, what Sun Tzu, the ancient Chinese philosopher, would call a golden bridge, a way out. And then you move forward. And my thing would be is repair. Actually, what I should say is do everything the American as U.S. can to preclude this strengthening of alliances that will come to be arraigned against the United States, are being arraigned against the United States, and that will potentially cause great harm to the U.S. You do everything we can to keep the United States from becoming isolated, a defeated empire that only has its friends, its vassal friends in Japan, in Australia, New Zealand, potentially Korea, but also to whatever's left of Western Europe that's worth talking about. That will be it.
And what would you say, Matt, to those who, like McMaster just did, and many others also? I mean, they're already saying that, my God, we have to win in Ukraine, because if not, it's going to be a green light to China in Taiwan. And if they see us literally surrender to here, which is what they would characterize what you said, and give Putin a golden bridge out, then we're going to be seen as so weak throughout the world. And then it's going to launch tyrants everywhere. What do you say to that charge?
No, I mean, that's not how the world views it. That's how McMaster, in his own right, in his bubble, views it, right, in his own warped perception, with his own need for confirmation bias and everything else. That's how he views it. It's not how the Chinese view it. If the Chinese view us rationally, and if they view us as something that they need to respect, that they have to trust how we act will be effective and will be not just effective, but also considered and perceptive, that we're actually thinking about what we're doing, they will engage us so. But if we act as we have been acting, foolishly, recklessly, without thought, obviously without a plan. McMaster can talk all he wants about winning Ukraine, but how are you going to win the war, General McMaster? I mean, it means meaningless. All you're saying is just propaganda. All you're doing is just spewing your narrative, reciting your talking points. That's it.
Yeah,
So,
the irony, and I didn't mention it a while ago, but where Keane was talking about basically driving Russia out of Crimea by whatever means, and General Hodges is the other, who's been talking about that ad nauseum from the beginning of the war. The reality is, even if somehow they were succeeded in doing that, the chances that wouldn't push Russia into at least seriously considering using nuclear weapons is almost nonsensical. There's, I think, no chance that Putin would ever allow his forces to be driven out of Ukraine militarily and not resort to nuclear weapons. So to succeed in what they're talking is to plunge us into nuclear war.
Well, and to the other aspect that Keane and the others, either they are ignoring it or they don't understand it, which, as I get older and older, I believe that these generals honestly just don't know how to do their jobs. They know how to do their talking points, but not their jobs. The other thing would be with say a NATO-Russia war is that NATO would, of course, if they're competent, strike Russian higher headquarters and command and control facilities deep within Russia. And that would allow, under Russian doctrine, that could allow for the use of nuclear weapons in response. I mean, like, this is all clear. This is all all things that are very well understood if you take the time to read something other than what your messaging statement says. But that's not who these people are. I mean, this idea of the United States continuing to put itself to make a reality of its own making and not understanding it. The best way to encourage the Chinese to attack Taiwan is to lose the Ukraine war. And if it's impossible to win,
not to bring it down, but to lose it. Yeah.
To lose it. Exactly. That's what the Chinese take away from Afghanistan is that the Americans broke the deal with the Taliban, that they had set up basically a corrupt puppet regime, that the slightest pressure, not the slightest, but that a well-organized and well-planned campaign by the Taliban were going to bring it down, particularly once the money came out. The Chinese understand all our weaknesses. They understand how poorly we execute things. They understand how poorly put together our campaigns are, how the foundations of what we build are built upon sand, essentially, corrupt sand, dirty sand, incompetent sand, right? So, I mean, that's what the Chinese understand. And the best way to counter the Chinese is to act in a manner that is effective, act in a manner that actually produces results, and act in a manner that's not so entirely predictable as we are, that we are going to chase ruin as recklessly and as while throwing as much money away as possible.
That's such a great point there. And what I want to reiterate as we close here is that the best way to encourage China to take action is to continue on with the foolish notion that you can perpetuate a war indefinitely and then lose it instead, as opposed to doing what makes sense and rational to cut off a clearly losing play, preserve your assets, preserve your forces, and preserve your resources in case they're needed elsewhere. That's what is going to deter China, not to plunge into an abyss and then get beaten, have your side get beaten. That's the worst case scenario of all.
Right. I had a friend who, it's about 13 years. What is it? It's 2024. So I think probably about 2010, he visited China. He spoke with a number of members of their foreign ministry, and he came back and he said, the Chinese told us they want to see happen. They want to see the Americans continue to be stuck in these endless wars. That there's no greater thing to assist the American decline and, by contrast, enable China's rise, if you will, is these wars that the United States is stuck in. And now, of course, we've got, whether it's not direct wars, but we're in two proxy wars, both in Ukraine and Gaza, that are hurting the United States across all lines of measurement. There's not one thing of benefit coming out of these, let alone, again, the moral horror of them, which we can never diminish. Which just on a pure national interest level, what we are doing supporting Israel and Ukraine is incredibly self-destructive.
Exactly. Well, listen, we'll leave it there on that happy note. And thanks so much for coming on, because if nothing else, we provide, with your analysis here, great clarity on what's really going on. People see these kinds of nonsensical statements by these so-called, experts and generals across the board, and they can see here that just why that's nonsensical. And if nothing else, we're going to continue to hold them accountable, at least on our channel, for the stuff that they're saying by putting out the truth. Thanks for coming on today, Matt. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Denny.
And we thank you guys for coming on. As always, we value your time, giving it to us. We also have another show coming up this afternoon. You don't want to miss this one. This is a new guest that we've had. It's a friend of mine that I've been on panels with in the past, a former Ronald Reagan administration official. And he's going to be talking in part about what you heard there by McMaster, who's claiming that we just need more of Reagan's peace through strength. But Doug's going to say that that's actually nonsense. That's a gross misreading of what Reagan actually did stand for. And he's going to talk to us about that this afternoon at 3 p.m. Eastern. Tune in, and we will see you on the next episode of Deep Dive.